Hello, my name is Rainbow Butterfly, and I'm here to talk some more about mental health and severe mental illness, and I'm especially talking about suicide ideation today. My main focus is on holistic health options, but I do want to just talk about suicide generally. And today I think one of the first things I want to talk about is my experience of what happens when you call for help. I want people to feel safe calling for help if they feel suicidal. And I know that not knowing what happens can make it really difficult to pick up the phone and dial 911, even if you're really a danger to yourself. So I'm going to talk about my experiences. I made these 911 calls in Portland, Oregon, so it might be a little bit different where you live. I called 911 and I talked to the operator. She asked what the emergency was, and I told her that I was afraid that I might hurt myself because because I had OSDD. I had a personality that I figured out that I wasn't conscious of, and that personality was suicidal. And so it was actually DID, and I was pretty afraid of what might happen because I was having some issues with this part that was suicidal. And so she asked me a few more questions just to clarify what I meant by that, because I tend to get technical without really realizing it, with people who don't necessarily know what I'm talking about. And I'm not really trying to do that. So I was just like, yeah, you need to send somebody basically for suicide ideation. And they were like, okay, they're on the way. And she just stayed on the line with me. And about 10 minutes later, they showed up. And this is something that you need to understand, because it can definitely be frightening if you're not expecting it, is they're going to send police. They will send a whole gaggle of cops. When I called this time, about 5 cops or something, I opened up my door and they were just in my apartment. And I was like, hello. So, then I brought them back to where I had been sitting down and meditating and working on some things. So I found this thing and got really frightened. And they said, okay, they said to the other people they were talking to, they were like, this person's cooperative, everything's fine. So they sent some of the cops back. They said they didn't need 5 cops to deal with me because I was willing to go to the hospital. So they just said okay, and they sent some of them back. I think they left like 2 cops with me. And while I asked if I could bring some stuff with me to the hospital, and they said I could, but there's not a lot of room in the ambulance, and that the most I could take, I think I took one bag that was really packed full, one backpack that was really packed full of stuff that I wanted to have with me at the hospital. Because while I was waiting for them, before I called the ambulance, I got together my stuff to go to the hospital. But I couldn't take as much as I thought that I would be able to. I could only take one bag, which was fine. It turned out to be actually just fine. But just keep that in mind, that if you pack something ahead of time or whatever that you want to grab in case you have to go to the hospital, then make sure that it's small enough to fit on the ambulance. And we got in the ambulance, and he asked me a lot of questions. He asked me about if I had any medical problems, why I was feeling the way I was and some things about my history. I don't know, he talked with me a lot on the ambulance, and then we went in, and they took me in on the gurney, and they took me into to the ER, and got me into an ER bed, where they asked me a bunch of questions, and as I was getting out of the ambulance, they had me sign a consent form. And got inside. Then they basically leave you alone. They're like, okay, wait here. Do you need anything? And if you want any water, like, ask for water, ask for, anything you feel like you need. If you're hungry, ask for some food, ask for some water, because if you're too hungry or you're thirsty, like, that's going to make your mental state worse, generally. So, and the ER can be a stressful place, I'll be honest. It kind of sucks, going in this way, because you have to sit in the ER for a while, and it's noisy, and there are people around that are going through stressful things, and everybody picks up on that stressful environment, whether they're really conscious of it or not. It's not a super calming place to be. So understand that you may be stuck in an ER room for a little while. But if you really think you might hurt yourself, it's worth it. And in my experience, they'll do everything they can to help you stay comfortable. They'll bring you water, they bring you food, keep the lights dim. Every once in a while, people come in and ask you questions. And they just ask you questions about what's going on with you and why you're there and what you might do to yourself, if you have a plan, if you have intent, like, how long have you been dealing with this. The questions they ask are probably going to follow from the answers you give, so telling you exactly what the questions are might not help. But do make sure that you know what all your medications are and what the dosages are, so they can keep giving those to you and adjust them if they need to. Make sure that you give them an emergency contact number if you have one. All that stuff. That's good stuff to have, in your bag. If you keep a bag for if you end up hospitalized, or a little kit or something that has these phone numbers and the information about your medication and everything else. It can make things a lot easier to have it written out ahead of time, especially because it can be pretty nerve-wracking to be in there. I've definitely done that, where even right before I go to the emergency room, like, to be honest, it might sound silly to call an ambulance or go to the emergency room, but you spent 30 minutes preparing ahead of time or longer. But, like, to be honest, you're going to be in the emergency room like 4 hours. So if you can make the whole process a lot easier by writing down the answers to all the questions of what medicines do you take, when was your last menstrual period, all of this stuff that people typically ask in the hospital. Now, I guess I'm super familiar with that because I grew up with a chronic illness. I know what the doctors tend to ask you. They want to know your date of birth. They want to know your medical history. Have you ever had any diseases, heart disease, diabetes, any of this stuff? They want to know what your allergies are. They want to know food allergies, medicine allergies. They want to know who your counselor is. They want to know how long you've been dealing with the suicide ideation. They want to know if you have a date set, if you have the means at home. Like, if you're thinking about hanging yourself, do you have a rope? If you're thinking about shooting yourself, do you have a gun? If they want to know, have you ever done it before? Have you ever actually attempted suicide before? And for somebody who hasn't attempted suicide, at least for me, before I ever attempted suicide, I didn't understand how important that question was. Because it's like, until you actually attempt, It's this whole other level. So when they know that you've attempted before, it really can let them know that this is extremely serious, even more so than somebody who hasn't attempted before, because multiple attempts, that tends to actually result in actual suicide. That's when people are really determined, because you're at just a whole new level of depressed, of fucked up, when you've actually attempted versus constantly thinking about and planning attempting. And trust me, I know that that place is hell, of constantly thinking and planning about suicide. That is hell. I'm not invalidating that, but there's a reason they asked that question. So if you've done it before, if you've attempted before, even if you didn't get caught, even if you didn't go to the hospital, you should tell them, because that's a huge, deeper level of risk. And they're going to be able to help you better if they understand that. So, if you don't want to be in the hospital, if someone else called, then, and you answer the questions and they decide to keep you there, they decide that you're going to be a danger to yourself, I highly recommend signing the consent form if you trust yourself to let yourself out when you're ready. I've only allowed myself to be put on a hold once. If you refuse to sign the consent form and they think you're a danger to yourself, or others, or you can't take care of yourself, or they just really think that you need to be in there for your safety generally, it's a safety issue if you're in crisis, basically, then they can put you on a 3-day hold. And this hold, hey honey, you're kind of completely blocking the camera. This 3-day hold, yep, he wants to cuddle with the camera. They can put you on a 3-day hold, and they can put you on a 3-day hold. But here's the thing, if you sign the consent form, you can let yourself back out whenever you want. I highly recommend signing the consent form, because then you're voluntary, and if you're voluntary, you can leave. Like, they have to go through a whole checkout process for you to leave, but one time I let them keep me on a hold. You're going right in front of the camera. One time I let them keep me on a hold, and that was because I had just been in the hospital and come out of the hospital again before I was ready to come out, because my judgment was impaired. So well, it wasn't that my judgment was impaired. I was just really confused, and I didn't, yeah. So I decided when I ended up back at the hospital again, just another day later, that I should probably let them put me on a hold, and that way I can't just let myself back out again in a day when I think I'm better. I actually have to stay in a few days and make sure. And it was a good thing, because I went in on like a Thursday or something, so it's 3 business days. So the hold didn't get released until like Monday, and I actually got the whole weekend of not even having to agonize over the decision of whether or not it was time for me to leave or not. Or think about any of that, because I didn't have the option to leave. I was just there for 5 days. And so the thing is that if they do place you on a hold, if they want to keep you on the hold, they have to take you to court. They literally have to take you to court, and they have to come up with evidence. They have to come up with evidence that you are a danger. They cannot just lock you up and keep you in a hospital. At least not here in Oregon. Here in Oregon, this is how it works. And I know that there are protections in many states. be very wise to find out what the laws are in your state for state or country or province as far as mentally ill people goes, as far as commitment goes. If they, most of the time, commitment is a legal process, and here in Oregon, it's easier to be committed if you've ever been committed before. They can commit you again much easier. So it's worthwhile to do everything you can not to do that. That might sound obvious, but it just means, like, if they want to put you in the hospital, sign the consent form, for the most part. Because then even if you hate it, like, just try it out, and then you can go home later, because you're in involuntary. If it doesn't work for you, you hate it, go home. But then they can't just keep you there. So, at the hospital I went to, at this hospitalization that I'm talking about, the 911, this 911 call. So I stayed in the emergency room. Now, sometimes, like, this place has a special emergency room section for mentally ill people. And the one guy called it purgatory, and I was like, yes, it totally is a purgatory. But it's just these really empty rooms that have beds in them and sinks. And waited around there for 4 or 5 days, I think, before they sent me to an inpatient unit. Otherwise, if they don't have something like that, that's sort of like a mental hospital or a psych ward setting inside the emergency room, because that was kind of specialized. So a lot of times you literally just have to sit in the emergency room. The last time I was in the hospital, that's what I had to do. I stayed in the emergency room, and it wasn't terrible. They were really nice, and the food was good. So, I stayed in there for the emergency room for about 4 or 5 days. And while you're in the emergency room, you can do things like ask for paper and pens. And at least at the hospital where I was at, like, you can't have a real pen by yourself, but they have these little pens where they took the ink well out of the pen and then put a silicone thing over it so it's bendy, so you can't stab anything with it. So you can still write. It's kind of a crummy pen, but you can still write with it, even though you can't hurt anybody with it. And so, ask for paper and a pen and do a bunch of journaling. Like, the thing is that you don't go to the hospital for suicide and then they give you something and it fixes it. That's not really an effective way to deal with suicide, and there's really nothing they can give you to fix suicide. So you go into the hospital, and for me, what works best is to do my best to really try to think about the things that it was unbearable to think about at home. The things that make me want to hurt myself. Because in the hospital, it's safe to do so because I can't hurt myself in there. So that's the place to do that kind of really extremely difficult work. If it's just so bad, that it can't be thought about without wanting to hurt oneself, then the hospital is the place to do that. So doing a whole lot of journaling while you're waiting in the emergency room makes the time go by before you get to the inpatient unit, and you'll already be on your way to recovery. Ask for lots of healthy food. At the hospital I was at, you can write things on there, so I just started writing things like spinach or leafy greens, stuff like that, and trying to pick, the most vegetables and fruits that I could get. They had lots of good seasonal fruit. There you go, Bubba. And so that's pretty much all I did was sleep, think, and write, and eat, and bathe while I was in the emergency room. There's not much else to do. And they come in and ask you questions from time to time. And they'll tell you, they might, they have to decide whether or not your situation is dire enough to admit you. It's actually rather difficult to be, admitted. I think a lot of people are really afraid, at least I used to be really afraid, that if I told anybody or mentioned to a hospital how I felt, that they would just lock me up and keep me there and not let me leave. But in reality, the mental health care system is so overloaded that it's more likely that you're going to have to convince them to let you stay. At least that's been my experience, is convincing them that, yes, it really is this bad, and yes, I really do need to stay here. I really am dangerous to myself, and I need to stay here. And giving lots of examples and evidence and reasoning. So, understand that the risk of getting stuck there against your will is, at least where I live, check your local laws, but it's very unlikely. You're more likely to just get the help that you need. And I think I'll do another video later on what it's actually like to be in an inpatient unit, and so many inpatient units can be so different that you have to understand that it's just the way one inpatient unit is. And I wanted to get through and talk about what actually happens when you call for help and what actually happens when you go to the emergency room for suicide. I guess another thing is, they have some limitations on things while you're waiting in the emergency room in order to keep you safe. They're going to take away your clothes. They're going to take away all your stuff. Unless it's something like you could specifically ask for it. You can say, can I have this thing out of my bag? And they'll look at it and they'll go, this looks like it's pretty safe. You can have it. And then they'll let you have it. And the other thing that they do is all of the equipment in the back, the medical equipment, they close up all the cabinets and lock them so that you can't get into them. And at the hospital that I was at, they don't let you have the door completely closed because they want to be able to peek in at you at any time and make sure that you're not hurting yourself. So you just wait there for a while. It depends on how busy the emergency room is and how busy your local inpatient admitting is, how full it is, because they usually have to wait for a bed to become free. They come in and take your blood pressure. They might do some tests. They might take a urine sample, usually. They want to test for drugs. They're not going to get any law enforcement involved. They just want to know if any substances are affecting your mental state. They might do a blood test. They might do any number of tests. If you tell them you have medical conditions, because some medical conditions can have an interplay with your mental health in such a way that they need to to treat that as well. They should definitely treat any physical pain that you're experiencing. If you're in any physical pain, ask for pain medication if necessary in order to get you comfortable, because pain is the most stressful thing there is. So, and you definitely want to reduce your stress level. Come on, baby. So, I can't say exactly what happens when you call a crisis line, because I have never called a crisis line. I've only ever called the ambulance, because I had just already decided that I needed to go in. So, but that's basically what happens if you, in the crisis line, I know that they may have some preliminary steps, but if they send someone to get you, they're going to send the police. So you at least need to be prepared for that. That can be really alarming, because, you're sad. You're not doing something wrong. It doesn't seem like you should have the police come after you. So, just do your best to realize that that's going to be what shows up at the door, is a bunch of armed police officers. But if you just like, hey, I'm willing to go with you, everything's cool, just go out to the ambulance, everything will be fine. I hope this was helpful. I appreciate you tuning in and listening to me talk about my experiences, and I hope that this can alleviate a certain amount of anxiety around calling for help or going to the hospital if you need to, making you more likely to choose the life-saving option if that ever becomes necessary. I appreciate the chance to help. I think that's it. Live long and prosper.